There's a movement in Illinois arguing that counties outside of Cook County should separate from Chicago's influence, either by forming a new state or by possibly joining another state. And I understand why this idea gets attention. I'm just a high school history teacher, government teacher in a small downstate rural school, but I do want to address it. Now, a lot of people in rural and downstate Illinois feel ignored, and they feel like state politics are dominated by Chicago and Cook County and the suburbs, and they believe that laws passed in Springfield do not always fit the realities of small towns and farming communities and rural counties. Now, that frustration is real, but the proposed solution is not realistic. So let's kind of take a look at the referendums that have been referenda that have been pushed out by several counties, like 33 by now. But when you have an advisory referendum, it does not create a new state. It does not separate counties from Illinois. It does not change laws. It's basically an official opinion poll, and it lets voters send a message. So even if voters approve it with a yes vote, that's just political speech. It's not a legal separation. And this is where we need to understand how government works. Now, the United States has a federal system, and power is divided between the national government and the state governments. Inside Illinois, counties do not have the same relationship with the state that the state has with the national government. Illinois has a more unitary structure within its borders. Local governments are not sovereign governments. They are created by the state. They're organized by the state. They're limited by the state. So a county is not a mini state. A county is a local unit of government. And most Illinois counties are non-home rule counties. That means they only have the powers specifically given to them by the Illinois Constitution or by state law. So in plain English, a non-home rule county can only do what the state gives it permission to do. It can't invent new powers for itself. It can't declare independence. It can't vote itself out of Illinois. It can't join Indiana or Missouri on its own. And it cannot create a new state by county board vote or by local referendum. That's the first major legal wall they run into. Now, the Illinois Constitution also does not provide a process for a county to secede from the state. It allows for changes involving counties inside Illinois, like forming or consolidating or merging or dividing or dissolving counties, or also transferring territory between counties. But those changes are within Illinois. That does not mean a county can leave Illinois, join another state, or create a new state on its own. The Illinois Attorney General addressed all this back in 2023, and he concluded that a non-home rule county they don't have the authority to secede from Illinois and join another state. So before we even get to Congress, the basic state level problem is this: counties do not possess the power that they would be trying to use. Then you add to that the U.S. Constitution. You get to Article 4, Section 3, and it says that a new state cannot be formed inside an existing state without the consent of that state's legislature or Congress, and Congress. So if part of Illinois wanted to leave and become a new state, it would need approval from the General Assembly in Springfield and Congress. And that's an enormous barrier. The Illinois General Assembly would have to agree to give up a large part of the state, and Congress would have to agree to add a new state, which would mean new senators and representatives and new electoral votes and a major political shift. Now, that's not impossible in theory, but in practical terms, it is extremely unlikely. Now, the second major problem is money. One common argument for separation is that Chicago just drains money from downstate Illinois, but the data doesn't support that claim. Research from the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute down at SIU Carbondale has shown that downstate Illinois receives more in state funding than it pays in state taxes. Cook County and the Chicago suburbs, by contrast to all that, receives less back when compared to what they send to Springfield. Now, that doesn't mean that downstate Illinois is lazy. It doesn't mean that rural counties don't matter. It means that the state is interconnected. Chicago and the collar counties generate a huge share of the state's tax base, and those dollars help fund roads and schools and universities and prisons and hospitals and Medicaid, human services, public safety, and local governments across the entire state. So if downstate counties separated, they wouldn't just be leaving Chicago politics, they would also be leaving Chicago's tax base, and that raises serious questions. Who pays for the roads? Who pays for schools, state police coverage, courts, prisons, public health, mental health services, and then the aid to local governments? So a new state made of mostly rural counties would have a smaller population, a smaller tax base, and many of the same expenses. Rural infrastructure is expensive to maintain. Roads, bridges, schools, emergency services, all those things don't become cheaper just because fewer people happen to live there. So the new state would probably face a hard choice. Raise taxes, cut services, or both. And that leads to another common misunderstanding, which is property taxes. People often blame Springfield and Chicago and the governor for property taxes. But in Illinois, property taxes are primarily a local issue. They are imposed by local taxing districts, like school districts, municipalities, counties, townships, park districts, library boards, fire protection districts. The state does not simply set your tax bill. Your property tax bill is shaped by local assessments and levies, local school funding needs, and all those things that are listed on your property tax bill. So if someone is angry about property taxes, separating from Chicago does not automatically solve that problem. In fact, it could be worse. If downstate counties lost state revenue supported by the Chicago area tax base, local governments and school districts would still need money. And where does that money come from? Well, the most obvious answer is higher local taxes, including property taxes. So the argument that separation would reduce property taxes is rather weak, and it may actually point in an opposite direction. The third problem that we face is complexity. Separating part of Illinois would not be just like drawing a line across the map. You'd have to divide state debt, pension obligations, public property, universities, prisons, highways, courts, tax systems, agency responsibilities. We need a new state constitution, a new governor, a new legislature, a new court system, a new budget, a new relationship with the federal government. And none of that is solved by an advisory referendum. The fourth problem is separating that when it comes to separating from Chicago, it doesn't really solve the deeper issue. And that is, if the frustration is that rural Illinois feels ignored, then the real question should be, how do we make state government more responsive to different regions? That's a legitimate question. Illinois is a large and diverse state. Chicago is not Carlinville. Cook County is not Macoupin County. And a farming community does not have the same needs as a dense urban neighborhood. But disagreement inside a state is not unusual. You look at Missouri. Missouri has St. Louis, Kansas City, rural Missouri. Indiana has Indianapolis and the rural areas. New York has upstate and NYC. California has LA, the Bay Area, the Central Valley, the northern counties. Texas has Austin, Houston, Dallas, and huge rural areas. So every state has regional tensions. Now, there's a word for what can happen when political communities keep breaking apart into smaller and smaller pieces because they no longer want to share government with people who disagree with them. And that's called balkanization. Historically, the term comes from the fragmentation of the Balkan Peninsula there in southeastern Europe. In modern political language, it describes the splintering of a larger political unit into smaller, competing, and sometimes unstable pieces. And that's a real concern here. If downstate should separate because it dislikes Chicago, then where does that stop, right? Should northern Illinois separate from southern Illinois? Should Madison County separate from Macoupin? Should Carlinville separate from Gillespie? Should the townships separate from county seats? At some point, the logic just kind of breaks down. So democracy requires sharing political space with people who don't always vote like us, live like us, or see the world like us. Now, that can be frustrating. But the answer to political disagreement cannot always be separation. Representative government is supposed to deal with regional tensions through elections and legislation, compromise, local government, courts, constitutional limits. The system isn't perfect, but it's far more realistic than trying to break the state apart. So the bottom line is, these referendums are legally non-binding. They don't create a new state. They do not remove counties from Illinois. Counties are units of local government, not sovereign states. So the Illinois Constitution does not provide a path for county secession. The United States Constitution would require approval from the General Assembly and Congress. All of this is a protest vote, and the referendum may send a message, but as a governing plan, it's not viable because the frustration is not a budget, and this slogan of Free Illinois is not a plan of government. It's not a constitution. And, well, an advisory referendum is not a plan. Thanks for watching.